So let's just have a word of prayer. Lord, I just thank you for Niels and thank you for his willingness to be able to share your word today. So, Lord, just pray your anointing upon him, that the words that he speak would be from you. And Lord, that we would listen to his message and see what you want to say to each one of us, that it would bear fruit in our lives. So just bless him and bless each one who hears us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Sorry, my fault. Amen. Thank you. Yeah, as Darren said, my name is Niels. I'm just recording this just for my mom. She obviously wanted to be here, and so I just wanted to, just video record it just for her. You know, at this age, parents always want to be there for their kids, right? And so again, my name is Niels, and I'm going to start off with a story. It's kind of funny. So there were these two guys, and they had died, and they ended up at the pearly gates in heaven. It was a pastor and a pilot. And so the St. Peter says to the pastor, he was just like, hey, like, welcome to heaven. You've done good. We're so happy you're here. Here's a robe, and here you go. Like, looks good on you. Yeah, welcome to heaven. And then the pilot walks up, and St. Peter's just like, welcome to heaven, man. Like, let's get him the best robe. Angels come out, and he gets like this robe. It's all decked out. It's full of gold. It's really nice. And then the pastor says, like, whoa, whoa, whoa. St. Peter, like, what's this? Like, why does the pilot get a better robe than I do? And then St. Peter says, well, son, you see up here, we work on results. When you preached, people slept. When he flew, they prayed. And so today, my message is called Faith in the Fire. I'm going to be reading from Daniel 3. You're more than welcome to follow along if you'd like. I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation. I'm going to be going just section by section, little bit by little bit. And so to start off, I'm going to do verses 1 to 7. So, this is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent his messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all these provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all the officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted, people of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bow to the ground and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And so we see here, actually, I just want to apologize for my voice. I am battling a head cold, but thankfully God is good. And so just in case my voice sounds funny. But moving forward, so Babylon, we see here, was full of idols already. And yet nothing will serve this arrogant and domineering king. They must have one more. They set up gods throughout the land, and they're going to continue to multiply them without measure. They're going to wander after them endlessly. And so it's kind of similar to our society. Well, if I was to ask the question, what idols do we maybe have in our life? And what idols do we maybe put on a pedestal? And some of these examples of idols are, it could be our career, culture, power, money, pleasure, approval, fame, success, ourselves, comfort. And it's not to say that these things are inherently bad. It's just that if you put them above God, then and they end up being up here, and God kind of goes down here. We may do this not knowing, then they kind of become idols. And another example, which could be more popular today, could be social media, right? Like, you could end up being on Facebook a lot or Instagram a lot. And it's not to say that social media is inherently bad. Like, I love using it because I can keep in touch with my family and I can post things that I like. But sometimes we can tend to idolize it when we're giving it more time than we are with God. And just like even on our phones, I just discovered just a few months ago that I can deposit checks on this bad boy, on the Scotiabank app, right? Instead of walking 20 minutes down to Scotiabank, and I can just do it on my phone with that. With the LA scroll, right? So, yeah, so then, so you can essentially use it to control your life. It's in a good way. You can manage your life on it, but at the same time, the amount of time that you put into social media, or the amount of, or now you tried to save time by, let's say, not going to the bank, that time could potentially become wasted because you unintentionally put it up on a pedestal. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, he set up an image which was 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and that's about 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and it was this really big, tall chocolate bunny. Just a VeggieTales reference for all those who didn't catch that. That story was about Rack, Shack, and Betty. Oh man, yeah. So anyways, he put up this gold statue, and then he gathers a lot of important people to bow down and worship the image. Regardless of whatever god they may be currently worshiping, he says, nope, you've got to worship this idol that I've created, because I'm the man. Then the majestic music played and lured them in, so that way they could bow down. And if they would not worship it, they would be thrown into a blazing furnace as their punishment. And so the question comes up, what idols do we have in our lives? Now I'm going to continue to read from verses 8 to 15. Daniel 3. Life reflection. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage, and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" So some would argue that it was actually strange that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were there in the first place, because they were already high officials and they'd already been appointed as administrators over the province of Babylon. So did they really need to be there? They probably could have just slipped away and decided into their important role. But it's because they had the courage, and we see here that faithful obedience without seeing is starting to manifest, and it's because they had courage and were willing to obey the king's orders as far as they could. They would essentially be willing to bear whatever public testimony came against this gross idolatry of the king. They had like I was saying, they had a very high position in office, and even though their master had set it up, they felt obligated to stand against it. We can go to the next slide. The astrologers were also known as Chaldeans, right? The astrologers were the ones who noticed that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not there, and that they were not bowing down to the king, and they were somewhat motivated to go and report this. And the reason why they were motivated is because in the previous chapter, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar he had a bad dream, and he needed someone to interpret it. And he said, "Someone needs to interpret my dream. If not, I'm going to kill him." And so that was, he had a bit of rage there. And then the astrologers tried. They couldn't do it. Then they called Daniel to do it. Daniel came in, had the peace of God upon him. And Daniel was just like, I can't necessarily interpret it, but God can speak through me, and we can interpret it that way. And so Daniel was able to. And then so as a reward for Daniel being able to interpret the king's dream, he got appointed to a high position and also got to appoint 3 administrators, which ended up being Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So you can see that the astrologers were ready to essentially take revenge on these three guys. We see here that the king was upset and enraged with fury, probably because this was seen as with such disrespect. Since the king had highly favored them, he had such favor upon Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was seen like a benefactor to these guys. He felt betrayed because he had rule and control over everything. He was the king. The power to be able to set up an idol, the power to do whatever he wants, and yet the three people he's appointed to a high position, almost like an executive position, he didn't have control over them. And so this was seen as outrage in the sense that he had no choice. Like, what do I do? Well, I have to punish these three guys for their rebellion. We see here that the king, he got really upset. And in situations like this, true devotion to Christ can calm the spirit and can cause a peace and a quietness. But at the same time, when there's a sense of evil with superstitions and evil coming from the idols manifesting, we see here that it inspired him with rage. It inspired King Nebuchadnezzar with to have a bad passion and fury, which essentially turned him into an evil person. He was so angry that he was ready to unleash his wrath. But these three men stood before him with courage. They were not willing to compromise and disobey the second commandment in Exodus 20, verse 4, which says, "You must not make yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or in the earth or the sea." They were not willing to disobey their God, Yahweh. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's believing confidence in God and their dependence on him, Yahweh, enabled them to look to him, knowing that their death was literally right around the corner. They were willing to suffer than to sin. The three knew that the king might not be able to that he would be able to torment the body, and that he would be able to put them through a fiery situation, but once they had died, the king could not touch them, because at that point they would be with God, they would be with Yahweh. And they would be in unity with Christ after they had suffered. I'm going to continue to read verses 16 to 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." So the courage that these three had said, God will deliver us, but even if he still doesn't, we're still not serving your gods. We're still not going to compromise. We're still not going to sin in this capacity. A good, clear picture of God and a full assurance that he is with us while we are with him. Right? It's going to help us when we're suffering, and even if he is for us, we don't need to fear what man can do to us. It's almost like let man do his worst. And what I'm about to say is not, I don't know if it's not really in the Bible, but I just wonder, it's three dudes, right? Shadrach's probably like, we can't do this. Meshach's like, bro, are you sure? And Abednego's like, I'm with you guys. I mean, bad boys for life. We ride together, we die together. Right? They're probably like, we're in this together. So the courage they had said, God will deliver us from death or in death. Do we have faithful obedience without seeing? In situations where we don't know the outcome, will we still obey? Maybe he's asking you, maybe God is speaking to you, and he's asking you to trust him in situations. Maybe even in the midst of your pain, in the midst of the suffering you might be facing right now, whatever is going on, maybe God is speaking to you right now, and he's saying, I need you to have faithful obedience, even though you can't see it. It kind of brings me back to that verse, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. God lights up the path as we go along and as we obey him. I'm going to continue to read verses 19 to 27. And so Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the three men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up three men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see four men unbound, walking around in the fire, unharmed, and the fourth looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. And so the encouragement that comes about here is that Jesus is with you in the fire. To backtrack, the king's attitude towards the three changed, right? And he ordered that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. And it's kind of strange because, why suddenly 7? Well, he was that ticked off. And it's not that, he wanted to torture, well, he obviously wanted to torture them and punish them, but he wanted to get rid of them 7 times as much. He saw their crime 7 times worse, and he had them firmly tied to make sure that they couldn't escape and that they couldn't get out of there. The king's request was so urgent, as we saw, and the fire was so hot that it killed the soldiers who were taking the three to the furnace. The promise of Isaiah 43, verse 2 was filled, we see, where it says, "When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze." They weren't necessarily trying to get out of the situation, but they believed that God would see them through it. Sometimes, as we go through things in life, we need other brothers and sisters, as we see here with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to walk with us on the journey. And accountability is key. And I'll just give an example. I was part of a Bible study a few years ago, and it was with a group of guys, and we would break off into pairs throughout the night, and we could share as much as we felt comfortable. We had 5 points of accountability that we would talk about every week. And it was attitude. How has your attitude been this week? How was your tithing? Your media intake, your devotions, your purity. And so again, like I said, you could share as much as you felt comfortable. And it was really cool that we had this ability to do that, because if one guy was struggling with purity, well, we could text each other, keep each other accountable. If somebody was maybe struggling to read the Word of God, or if they were lacking in their devotional life, we could text and be like, "Hey, how's your Bible reading going?" And be like, "Yeah, it's not good." "Okay, well, why don't you try reading this passage?" The key here was accountability. And we see here with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had this pact, right? Like nothing could really break them and tear them apart. And that's kind of like in our spiritual walk. We kind of need that. We need accountability, brothers and sisters who are going to look after each other. That's where the life groups and the home groups come in. And this was important and pivotal in my spiritual growth, this accountability, because I needed that accountability as I was growing into becoming a man, coming out of a young adult into a man. Because when the journey gets tough, we face temptations, right? Like I actually wonder, like with Shadrach, like I was saying, were they tempted? Were they like, are we sure we want to do this? No, we definitely do, right? It's a big deal. Like, their lives were literally about to end. Verse 25, it says, "Look, I see a fourth man who they say looks like the son of the gods." And this is where they believe they saw the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. And so Daniel is in the Old Testament, and so hundreds of centuries before the New Testament. And so it's not saying that it was Jesus Christ. It's just they think that they saw something that looked like the son of the gods, and he was walking with them in the fire. Perhaps it was an angel or a heavenly message or a heavenly messenger. And the encouragement that I have here is that God is with you in the fire. And also in the storm. And I'm just going to read a little bit from Mark chapter 4. And this is the example of when Jesus calms the storm. And it's around verse 37 to 41. "A furious swell came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?' He got up and rebuked the wind and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' The wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified, and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." And it was interesting because in that moment, the disciples were fearing the storm, right? And I can't imagine what they're going through right now with all the different hurricanes and how they're fearing the storm. And it's probably easier said than done if I was to say to you, put your hope in Jesus. But that's what we need to do as believers, is to put our hope in Jesus, because Jesus is with you in the storm. And so their fear was no longer in their circumstance, but their fear, it's not that they were afraid of God, like, ooh, he's spooky, like things like, no, it was more like they feared the power that he had and that he is God. So be encouraged as you go through these fires and storms, because it strengthens your faith. And for some of you, you may be in the fire right now, whether it's a financial fire or a stress, bad relationships, family, medical reports. Who is your hope in? I'm going through that right now with medical reports and stuff, and I'm learning that in the midst of this fire, I need to trust in Christ. And that's why when I was asked to speak on, God was like, Daniel 3, you're going through it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so I'm going to read from 1 Peter 4:12-13. Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you are going through as if something strange were happening to you. Instead, be very glad, for these trials make you partners with Christ in his suffering, so that you will have the wonderful joy of seeing his glory when it is revealed to all the earth. Those that suffer for Christ have his grace and presence with them in their sufferings, even in the fiery furnace, even in the valley of the shadow of death. And therefore, they need not to fear no evil. And that verse from 1 Peter is unique, because we talked about it a couple weeks ago in Life Group, where some of our brothers and sisters in China and in the Middle East are currently going through persecution, and they're going through trials, and they're going through it because of their faith, and they're in the fire all the time. And for us, we're in different fires and stuff, but the point is that we're still in it. And as much as their hope is in Christ in the midst of their storm or fire, our hope needs to be in Christ as well. I'm going to read verses 28 to 30 from Daniel 3. Drink some water. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's commands and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. It's interesting, right? Because then when the king saw that the three had not been touched or burned or scorched, that nothing had happened to them, again, we see that he ordered this decree that anyone who says anything against their God be cut into pieces and that their houses be turned into piles of rubble. It was interesting because the king didn't necessarily surrender his life to God. He didn't surrender his life to Yahweh in that moment, because the king himself was not ready to commit to worshiping their God, but he still had such respect for him that he said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." And you can go to the next slide, please. This reminds me that even though God can do so much for us in our lives, sometimes we still feel we need God to do more in order for us to be convinced that he is the Lord that we should worship. For everything that God has done in your life and set you free from, are you fully committed to worshiping him? Are you living a life that is surrendered to him, to where you are devoted to the Father based on the evidence of transformation that you have experienced, or do you still need him to show you more? I mean, I can't prove to you in this moment that God exists, but I can say that I'm living proof of experiencing transformation of what God has done in my life and set you free from it. And there's other people here in this room, you've experienced the transformation of Christ in your hearts, and you've accepted him, and you're living proof of this as well. So are you living a life that is surrendered to him where you are devoted to the Father based on the evidence of transformation that you've experienced, or do you still need Him to show you more? And the way in which He shows us more is if we spend time with Him, if we get in the Word, if we spend time in prayer. Getting involved in one of the groups, because now we have 3 as it was announced, is another great way to grow. I found not just with our group, but just like growing up in as a Christian, that the life group for me was like the backbone of the church. That's where like I grew in my faith. That's where I could ask questions, right? Where you might not necessarily have the opportunity to ask right now, but you can ask challenging questions. You can grow in that, and you can challenge yourself as a believer. You can dig into the Word together, and you can also find commonality, because then at the same time you meet a really good group of friends as well. So many good benefits to groups. That was a plug, by the way. And so, worship team, you can come up at this moment. And so I'm just going to kind of go over some of the main points that I talked about as God is maybe speaking to you. And again, this sermon was called Faith in the Fire. Maybe there's idols in your life that you need to surrender to Christ. And like I was saying, they're not necessarily, maybe you're not like worshiping other gods in that sense. I'm just talking about maybe there's different things that you may have put on a pedestal without realizing. You realize that you've given time and energy into areas which are kind of meaningless, and so you just need to surrender that to Christ. As over the next song, maybe you want to spend time with that and just confess that to Christ. Maybe you need faithful obedience without seeing because of the situation that you're in right now. You need God, as you follow God, like I was saying, He'll light up your steps, He'll light up your path. Your Word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. You just got to take those little steps and just obey those promptings from the Lord. As He's telling you to take steps forward, perhaps it's an addiction and God is saying, no, I need to set you free from that. You're going to have to take steps forward in order to come out of that. Jesus is with you. Number 3 was that He's with you in the fire, so regardless of whatever financial or stress or family or relationship or chaotic situation you're in, the encouragement is that Jesus is with you in the fire or in the storm. And the last thing is that are you committed to worshiping God for everything that He's done in your life and for everything that He's set you free from? And so I just really like that song, Jesus, I Need You, and the worship team's going to sing it. I'm just going to pray for you right now. Father God, we just thank you just for this opportunity, dear God, just to learn about you and to learn from the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and just the courage that they had. And for some of us, we're in situations right now where we need that courage. And so, God, I just pray that you would just begin to speak courage into people's hearts right now. Dear God, perhaps it's idols that they need to confess and surrender to you and spend more time with you. Perhaps it's faithful obedience without seeing, dear God. For some, they're going through a fire right now, and they're in the middle of a storm and in the battle, and they don't know what the outcome is going to be. So, God, I just pray that you would just speak peace to that situation, that you would be the one that we turn to, dear God, that you are in the middle of the storm. I thank you, dear God, that our hope can be in you. And lastly, dear God, for some of us, the question is, are we really committed? Are we really committed in putting our time and energy into growing and worshiping as a fully devoted follower of you? And so for some, you're speaking that you want more of us, dear God, as we want more of you. For some of us, there's a hunger and a thirst that you're inspiring in us, dear God. And the ways in which that's going to manifest is if we become part of a group, is if we serve in the church, as we spend more time with you. And so I just pray that as we learn more about becoming a fully devoted follower of you, that you would just manifest that hunger and thirst. Amen. So I just want you to encourage you just to stand as we go through this next worship song, Jesus, I Need You. And then following that, I'll come and read a benediction and close.
Lord, be my anthem. Lord, when the world has fallen quiet, you stand beside me. Give me a song in the night. Jesus, I need you every
I'm going to read from Jude verses 22 and 23. Be merciful to those who doubt. Save others by snatching them from the fire to show others mercy. Church, go in peace.